Good morning, everyone. It's great to see you. Happy New Year to you. I wonder how you're feeling about 2025, because your answer to that question will depend on a variety of things. Things like your personality. Some people's personality will be like, New Year, bring it on. Other people will be thinking, have I got to go through all that again? Depending on your personality, it will depend as well on what you know is coming up this year. For some of you, you'll have really exciting prospects, and so you just can't wait to get to them. For others, you'll have really big concerns looming in your front view for this coming year. Health concerns, or financial concerns, or relational concerns, all sorts of things, possibly. And I guess how you're feeling about 2025 will also depend on how you feel about last year. If last year was wonderful, then this year, hey, again, bring it on. If last year was very difficult, it could be making you fairly fearful about this year coming up. One of the Roman gods in the times of the Romans was called Janus. Janus was the god of beginnings, of transitions, of gates and of doors. And you'll notice on this picture that Janus, therefore, looked both ways. At the start of the year, would look both ways. At any transition, would look both ways. Hence, where January comes from. There, you've learned something this morning. Our term January comes from the Roman god Janus, who looked both ways, as we do kind of at this point in the year. However you're feeling about this coming year, there's no doubt that the start of a year is a good opportunity for reflection, for reassessment. And to help us with that, we're going to take a 4-week look at some of the famous characters in the Old Testament as recorded in the book of Hebrews, which is part of the New Testament. Now, Hebrews, this letter is written to Christians back in the first century who are from a Jewish background. And for them, the transition from Judaism to what became known as Christianity has been extremely difficult. Following Jesus for them is very, very tough indeed. They're under pressure on various fronts. They're under pressure to revert to Judaism because of trouble they're happening, because of persecution they're suffering, and because of some theological confusion. All of which are tempting them, having turned from Judaism to find in the roots of Judaism now Jesus, the fulfillment of it all, to revert back to Judaism. They're under a whole load of pressure. And the writer's goal, we don't know who wrote the letter to the Hebrews, but the goal of that writer is to encourage his readers to stand firm, trusting in Jesus by showing them that even though following Jesus is really tough and perhaps not quite what they'd anticipated, that he really is the Messiah, the one that they had waited centuries for. And as you work through the letter, his argument continues. And by the time you get to chapter 10, verse 35, he's saying this to them: so do not throw away your confidence in Jesus. It will be richly rewarded. Even if you're having a tough time in this life, your hope in Jesus will be richly rewarded. And then 4 verses later, he says this: we do not belong to those who shrink back and are destroyed, but to those who have faith and are saved. And then you turn over into chapter 11, and he sets off to explain what faith is. It's the beginning of chapter 11 is the famous, this is what faith is, explanation in the New Testament. And then he illustrates what faith is. Having defined it, he illustrates it with a series of summaries of stories of the characters in the Old Testament that his readers would have been very, very familiar with. So the end of chapter 10, come with me, the end of chapter 10, keep going. Jesus really is it. Keep following in him. You will be richly rewarded. We are people of faith. Here's what faith is. Here are some examples of faith. And then if you turn over into chapter 12, he's basically saying the same thing that he did back here at the end of chapter 10. Chapters 10, 11, and 12 are like an encouragement sandwich. Keep going by staying focused on Jesus. Here are some people who stayed faithful to God. Keep going by staying focused on Jesus. It's an encouragement sandwich to them. So, who are some of these famous characters that he gives some summaries of their stories in Hebrews 11? Well, he talks about Abel, he talks about Enoch, he talks about Noah, he talks about Abraham, who we'll look at today. He talks about Joseph, about Moses, about Rahab. And then in verse 32, he continues. Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, the prophets, who through faith, listen to what they did, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised. They shut the mouths of lions. We know that story. They quenched the fury of the flames and escaped the edge of the sword. Their weakness was turned to strength. They became powerful in battle and routed armies. I mean, these are extraordinary exploits of faith that God's people did, stories that they knew very, very well. And then, very interestingly, the next words are these. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. What is this second list of people doing in this chapter about heroes of faith? These people seem to have failed. These people didn't conquer kingdoms and quench fires. What are they doing here? Well, the next words tell us. Verse 39, we read this. These were all commended for their faith. Those who did extraordinary exploits and those who seemingly didn't achieve such things but were killed, were persecuted, were sawed in two because of their faith, persecuted and troubled, both of those groups of people were commended for their faith. What he's saying is that people of faith do amazing things by faith, and people of faith suffer by faith. And then he goes on to say, the very next bit is this. Yet none of them, neither of these groups of people received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that together with us they would be made perfect. Whatever exploits they did, whatever suffering they went through, God had planned something better for them to inherit along with us. Guess who that's all about? Jesus, and what we inherit in him. And even those Old Testament characters, their true inheritance is found once Jesus has come and what God will reward them with. Anyway, all those characters in Hebrews chapter 11 were on a faith journey with God. And every journey, of course, begins with setting out. It begins with setting sail. Questions like this: where am I going? And why? Well, there's a short summary of Abraham's story, including the bit where he set sail on his journey of faith with God, that's recorded in chapter 11, which we're going to read. It's absolutely fascinating. If you've got a Bible, you'll have it at Hebrews chapter 11. If you haven't, it'll be on the screen. Hebrews chapter 11, the writer starts to talk about Abraham at verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children, because she, Sarah, considered God faithful, who had made the promise. And so from this one man, Abraham, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. Verse 17, by faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it's through your offspring, through Isaac, that your offspring will be reckoned. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. Abraham is one of the major figures in the scriptures. He is mentioned, in fact, in the New Testament 74 times. I reckon if you did a Jewish top 10 of Old Testament characters, I reckon he'd probably come in at number 2. I think David would be 3. Moses, of course, would be number 1. Abraham is a seriously big figure. He's the father of the Jewish people. He's the one through whom God promised to bless all nations on earth. He's the model of justification by faith, and he's the only one, I think, in the entire Bible who is called the friend of God. Twice, which is quite a title. Now, we should acknowledge that Abraham's journey, his physical journey, his journey of faith, was unusual in a number of respects. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, he didn't know where he was going, which just sounds utterly ridiculous. So God spoke to him way back when he was in Mesopotamia. Genesis chapter 12 records it like this. The Lord had said to Abraham, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. And that's kind of all that he got, it seems, at that point. Go. I'll show you where. Imagine telling your family that you're moving. And obviously they want to say, well, where are we going? And you say, I have no idea. But we're going. All the upheaval, all the chaos, all the loss of familiarity, and you don't know where we're going. Imagine being on the way, and people stop you as you camp for the night, and they say, oh, where have you come from? Where are you going? Well, I've come from Mesopotamia. Where are you going? No idea. You look like an intelligent man? What do you mean? You don't know where you're going. I have no idea where we're going. Imagine the number of days not knowing where you're going. Imagine the doubts he must, or certainly some of his huge family and household must have had. Imagine the difficulties on the way, all the while not knowing. Is that faith? Or is it foolishness? Anyway, somehow on the way, or as they arrived at a particular place, it became clear where God had led them. The record in Genesis tells us they set out for the land of Canaan, not knowing that's where they were going, and they arrived there. But it's an unusual journey because he didn't know where he was going. It was an unusual journey as well because where he went became his inheritance. Back to the Genesis account, it actually became his descendants' inheritance. God said to him, as recorded in Genesis, to your offspring I will give this land. And it's unusual as well. It's an unusual journey as well, because he went because he clearly heard God speak to him. Now, Abraham and his family had been a worshipper of other gods. The most famous god in that part of the world, where they came from, was the sun god. They worshipped other gods. But he leaves his country, he leaves his people, he leaves his father's household because he's heard God call him. I wish it would say in the text, and this is how he knew. Don't you? We don't know how. Did he audibly hear God? Did he have an internal sense of something? Something remarkably dramatic must have convinced him that from not knowing God at all, suddenly this God speaks to him and he leaves all of that and creates huge upheaval for his whole household as they travel hundreds of miles to Canaan. Now, I have to say, most of my life has not been like that journey. I'd like to think normally I do know where I'm going. I've moved my family a number of times. But my ancestors, my descendants are not going to inherit Lewis or Torquay or Bournemouth, to my knowledge. And it's unusual as well, because I'm not sure that I could often honestly say, in such dramatic terms, I know God has spoken to me and we've just got to go even though we don't know where we're going. It's an unusual story. But in what ways does Abraham's unusual story resonate with us as we set sail, as you set sail, in 2025? How does this story help me find answers to questions such as, where am I going and why? What does this story have to teach me about not drifting in 2025? Well, a number of things, a whole load of things. Here are some. The first one is this, that there's a sense in which not knowing where we're going is true of all of us as we set out on another year. I suspect if I said to you, have you got this year absolutely planned out, you know exactly where you're going, no one would be able to put their hand up. You might have some ideas, you might have some thoughts, but there's a sense in which we all set out not knowing where we're going. Think about 2024. Did you really know where you were going? Was where you ended up exactly where you thought you'd end up in 2024? Did you really set sail in 2024 with everything mapped out? Has anything ever happened as you thought it would? Probably not. There's a very real sense in which all of us are setting out, not knowing where we're going. Most of us get on with what God has created us to do and given us to do, and that's okay. You don't need a dramatic goal or a dramatic voice from God to start moving anywhere, because there's a sense in which all of us don't know where we're going. The only person who was in charge of his own destiny was Jesus. And there never will be another. Only he could be, because he is Lord of all. So there's a sense in which Abraham's story does resonate with us, because we're all setting out, not really knowing where we're going. But secondly, our job then, our role is to emulate Abraham, who we're told obeyed and went. Or as Genesis chapter 12 verse 4 puts it, Abraham went as the Lord had told him. As succinctly is that. And in fact, in this Hebrews 11 passage, there are 4 examples of Abraham's and Sarah's faith. that what they heard God say, they did. Verse 8, by faith he obeyed and went. Verse 9, by faith he made his home in the promised land. By verse 11, by faith Sarah was enabled to bear children. Verse 17, by faith when God tested him, he offered Isaac as a sacrifice. Now this is instructive for us. The way to not drift this year is to make it your goal to obey God through trusting him and what he says. If you want a compass point for this year, let's go this way. If you want a compass point for this year, make it this: what God says, I will do. As Abraham did. And as you find that the currents of life cause you to drift, that would be a good compass point. No, hang on a minute, I'm obeying what God has said and I'm back on track. And then you drift over this way as another current takes you. And you think, no, hang on a minute, I set my compass point there. Let's have a look, let's see what it says. It says get back to here. And that compass point of obeying whatever it is that God tells you to do will serve you well this year. And we can say this: Abraham obeyed the bit he knew at that point and went. It's always dangerous when you know the end of the story, the whole story, the end of the story, to miss what it must have been like at the beginning or along the way. But you have to remember this. Though we know, of course Abraham would by faith leave where he was and go to where God had called him to do. Of course, I would do the same. But you know the end of the story. You know that of course that was the right thing to do. But remember, at the beginning of his journey, the only instruction he has is go. That's it. A very, 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 very costly go. Leave your country, leave your father's household, and go. That's all he had. Get moving. That's what he does. He probably didn't even know which direction to go in. But he just got moving. And you know, that might be quite instructive for us. Because perhaps sometimes we get a bit stuck looking at this year ahead and think, where am I meant to end up? And that could be really helpful if God gives you an end up. But it may be simply that he says to you, get moving. And you think, but where, Lord? Just get moving. Voltaire was an 18th century French writer and philosopher, and he said, which Abraham would have owned, I'm sure, well, I don't know where I'm going, but I'm on my way. Which is not bad advice, actually. And for us who live here today, we have plenty to get moving with. Plenty. In fact, the majority of what God has called us to do and to move into in our journey with him has already been set out for us because he's given us the parameters, at least in very broad terms. So if you read the Gospels, Jesus at one point is asked, what's the greatest commandment? And he says the greatest commandment is to love God, in my paraphrase, with all you've got. And the second is just like it, to love others with all you've got. Now let me just say to you, that's enough to be getting on with. If you had nothing else, if God said nothing else to you for the rest of your life, there's plenty. I don't know all that that means. Just get moving. Loving God with all you've got. Loving people with all you've got. Take another example. Ephesians chapter 5 talks about loving and forgiving. Laying your life down for others. Now, you may not have a specific, God has told me to go here or do that, but he's told you that. There is so much already set out for us in God's word for us to be getting on with. So for all of us, we can get moving because God has spoken to us, and that also acts as a compass that helps us not to just drift. Am I loving God with all that I've got? No, I'm off course. Well, let's get back on course. Let's stop drifting because we have been given enough to get moving with. And add to that, some of what God calls us to is a step-by-step obeying and going, which is what I've kind of been hinting at. Living by faith is less sat-nav faith and more foggy faith. What I mean is this: when I get in my car and I put in my sat-nav, it gives me, amazingly, a destination and an entire route. A destination and an entire route. Living by faith in God is less like that. I don't know about you, but I don't have this year's destination exactly pointed and the route all along the way. Have you? Maybe you have. In which case, come and help me. How to find it. But I suspect that's not the case. It's more foggy faith. What I mean is this: I know the next step to take in loving God and loving people. I know what the next step is. You know what fog's like? You just can't see, can you, very far. But even in really dense fog, you can probably see just in front of you. And what happens as you take that step in front of you? I can see the next bit. Oh, okay, I'll step there. And I can see the next bit. Oh, I better step there, and I better step there. I think the journey of faith, of trusting God, living by faith, is more like that than it is sat-nav faith. But sometimes people wait for sat-nav faith, and it's probably not coming. So in order not to drift in 2025, the question most of the time is probably less, what's the big calling, the destination, and more, what's the next step for you? Do you know what that would be? The next step. Take that. And when you take that, you'll see the next step. And take the next step. I'm pretty sure that that's what Abraham's journey was like. Day by day, seeing the next bit, sensing from God what the next thing to do was, and so on and so on. And then thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, Abraham teaches us, if we're not to drift, teaches us to fix our eyes on where we're really going. Now, God promised Abraham, verse 12, descendants as many as the stars of heaven and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. And for the duration of the Old Testament, he promised his descendants a land as their inheritance too. But deep inside Abraham, according to this passage, he knew that wasn't the real goal of God's promises to him. Let's go back and read verse 9. By faith, Abraham made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. That's strange. He lived in tents, as did Isaac, his son, and Jacob, his grandson, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Go to verse 13. All these people that he's mentioned up to this point. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them at a distance and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they'd been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. If you spend all your time, energy, and hopes in 2025 on this life, you will have drifted from the very thing that God has ultimately called you to and saved you for. Paul writes an extraordinary thing to the Corinthians. And he says, if we have hope only in this life, we are to be pitied more than all people. Why don't you have that as a verse above your mirror this year? If I hope only in Christ for this life, I should be pitied more than anyone else. Looking beyond this life will keep you on course in this life. And of course, the New Testament teaches us what this heavenly city will one day be like. It's a city that God is preparing when Jesus has returned and brought us all to himself. It's a place, it's a city, it's our true inheritance, it's our true destiny. It's where we're truly setting sail for, where God is with his people without hindrance, and where there is no sickness and no tears and no death anymore. Jonathan Edwards says, it becomes us to spend this life only as a journey toward heaven, to which we should subordinate all other concerns of life. Why should we labor or set our hearts on anything else but that which is our true end and happiness? Jackie once went to Zambia for a wedding, this is years ago. I knew when she was getting back and the plane was on time, and I took our 3 boys, who I don't know, maybe were 10 and 7 and 4 at the time, and I took them to Heathrow to greet her on her return. And the New Testament speaks in these kind of terms of being on tiptoes, waiting for Jesus to come back, and waiting for resurrection life in the new heaven on the new earth. And my 3 boys, as we waited for Jackie, were just like that. They were looking, they were on tiptoes, waiting for her arrival. And the New Testament talks in terms like that about waiting for Jesus' return, or waiting for the time when we go to be with him forever in perfection, and waiting on tiptoes, because that's where we've truly been headed for. That's where we're really setting sail for. And if you keep a focus on life beyond this life, it will keep you from drifting in this life. And if you're not a Christian here this morning, I want to kindly and graciously say to you, there is a life beyond this life. And you probably know that. And life beyond this life is what we were destined for. By faith and trust in Jesus, to be rescued through death into his presence, or if he returns before we die. That is our true compass point that keeps us on track, focused on Jesus, obeying God in this life. And I wonder, as we wrap up, whether it might be possible to say of Abraham that he surrendered where he was in his old place. Let's have the band up, can we? He surrendered where he was in favor of obeying God, whatever it meant, even though he didn't quite know where he was going. And I wonder, as we set sail this year, as you set sail this year, If you're not a Christian this morning, as you set sail this year, maybe God is wanting us to surrender our hopes for all the details planned out, or for whatever we might have had in mind, and surrender and say, God, I will obey and go whatever that means, in big ways and small ways, just as Abraham did in this story. I wonder with me this morning whether you can surrender and say, God, I don't know all that this year has got, but you are God, and I am not. But I love being one of your children and knowing that every step you are with me. And I will set my compass point to be, Lord, whatever you're saying, I surrender and obey. I wonder if you will be able to say that with me this morning. So we'll respond in a minute. We're going to sing the first half of this song, and then I'll come back and surrender. What might be your step this morning? What might be your heart posture that God is asking of you? Let's stand, can we please?